Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, September 28th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The House kills a resolution to ban transfer of cluster bombs. So the House on Wednesday night voted down an amendment to the Pentagon appropriations bill that was introduced by Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, and this would have banned the transfer of civilian killing cluster bombs to other countries. The amendment failed in a vote of 160 to 269, with only 85 Republicans and 75 Democrats supporting the measure. I have to say, it's pretty amazing to see more Republicans voting against cluster bombs than Democrats. So cluster bombs, as we have covered a lot, they spread small submunitions over large areas, and they are so hazardous to civilians because many of these submunitions might not explode on impact, and they can be found years later or decades later, as they are being found still in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and they're usually found by children. And because of their indiscriminate nature, cluster bombs are banned by over 100 countries. And the vote on Gaetz's amendment came after the Biden administration announced a new weapons package for Ukraine that included the second tranche of cluster bombs in the form of 155 millimeter artillery shells. The administration first shipped cluster bombs to Ukraine in July. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has claimed that without the widely banned munitions, Ukraine would be defenseless. So according to recent media reports, the administration has also agreed to provide Ukraine with Army tactical missile systems, the ATACMS, that will be armed with cluster munitions. And this would be a huge escalation because not only would they be getting the ATACMS, which have a range of up to 190 miles, they're going to be armed with cluster bombs, and that means Ukraine could potentially target Russian territory with American cluster bombs. So besides the vote on the cluster munitions, the House also voted down two amendments aimed at reducing U.S. support for the proxy war in Ukraine. One amendment was introduced by Representative Andy Biggs. He's a Republican from Arizona, and that would have stripped $300 million in military aid for Ukraine. That's included in the Pentagon appropriations bill. That was rejected in a vote of 104 to 330, with only Republicans supporting the measure. And there was another amendment that was also introduced by Matt Gaetz that would have cut off all military support for Ukraine, and that failed in a vote of 93 to 339, and it also only received support from Republicans. So these are pretty bad numbers, but one thing is that it does look like there's more Republicans voting to cut off Ukraine than before. I know Gaetz has introduced an amendment like that to some other bill in the past, and I believe it was 70-something Republicans that voted it, so it's up to 93 now. But still, I mean, the cluster bombs, just the fact that these things are known, we know that they're going to kill civilians. Much of the world has banned these weapons, yet Biden and the Democrats and 269 people in the House think it's fine to send them over to Ukraine to fuel this proxy war with Russia. It's just complete insanity. And there was a vote a few months back also related to cluster bombs, but that was only banning them, the transfer to Ukraine, and that received less support than this one did. This one is a blanket ban on transferring them altogether. But hopefully, this effort continues and the opposition to this crazy policy grows. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine asks the West to bomb drone factories in Iran and Syria. So Ukraine asked its Western backers to bomb drone factories in Iran and Syria and also in Russia. The Guardian reported on Wednesday, citing a document Kiev submitted to the G7 in August. So in this document, Kiev alleged that Iranian drones Russia has used to bombard Ukraine contained Western components. Ukraine claims that Iran had diversified its drone production using a factory in Syria. and that the production would eventually shift to Russia. So the document suggests that Ukraine's Western backers could launch, quote, missile strikes on the production plants of these UAVs in Iran, Syria, as well as on a potential production site in the Russian Federation, end quote. The document says that Ukraine could launch the strikes if provided with the weapons capable of doing so. It says, quote, the above may be carried out by Ukrainian defense forces if partners provide the necessary means of destruction, end quote. So this is a pretty serious thing Ukraine is suggesting, is for the U.S. to bomb Iran or Syria to destroy these drone factories. And for their part, Iran's position is that they have not provided Russia with drones since the invasion of Ukraine was launched, and that claim was repeated by Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi last week at the UN General Assembly. It does seem to be pretty clear that Russia is using Iranian drones. I think the Iranians are saying, no, we provided them to them and now they can build their own or something like that. But the Ukrainian document claims that Iran is trying to disassociate itself from providing Russia with weapons and cannot cope with Russian demand and the intensity of use in Ukraine. So there's no indication right now that the U.S. or any of other Ukraine's Western backers would bomb Iran or Syria for Ukraine. Now, we know that Israel frequently bombs Syria. They launch a lot of airstrikes there, and they also carry out a lot of covert attacks inside Iran. But those things have been happening for a long time, long before Russia's invasion. Now, there was one attack, this was in January of this year, a drone attack targeted an Iranian military facility in the Iranian city of Isfahan. And the attack was, U.S. officials said that Israel was behind this attack. And they also said, this was in comments to the Wall Street Journal, which is how we usually find out about Israeli attacks inside Iran. They don't officially take credit, but usually U.S. and Israeli officials leak it to the media that it was Israel. And it was interesting because these U.S. officials noted, they kind of stressed that this attack came as the U.S. and Israel were discussing ways to counter Iran's military capabilities and its growing relationship with Russia. So they were kind of hinting that it might be related. But we haven't seen really Israeli attacks or any major Israeli attacks inside Iran since then. All right. But you could see how, say they do start doing something like that, the U.S. or any other Western countries, you could see how this war can really escalate. The next one here, Russia says that the U.S. and U.K. helped coordinate attack on Crimea. So Russia's foreign ministry on Wednesday said that the U.S. and Britain helped Ukraine with the September 22nd missile strike that targeted the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, Crimea. So this is Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. She said, quote, there is not the slightest doubt that this attack was pre-planned with the use of Western intelligence means and NATO satellite equipment and spy planes, and was implemented at the request of and in close coordination with the U.S. and British secret services, end quote. So a Ukrainian source told BBC that the strike was launched using British-provided Storm Shadow missiles. So we do know that the British did enable the attack at least. But the full extent of British or U.S. involvement in the attack is not clear. Acting Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland said back in February that the U.S. was supporting Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which suggested that the U.S. might be providing intelligence for such operations. I assume that they are, if the U.S. is providing Ukraine intelligence for attacks on Russian troops inside Ukraine. They don't consider Crimea to be Russia. It does also seem like they're providing intelligence for the drone attacks inside Russia. But that might be more covert. When it comes to Crimea, the U.S. doesn't consider that to be Russia, and they treat it, there's been indications that they treat it the same as the areas of Ukraine that Russia has taken control of. So anyway, where was I here? But I just mentioned that recently, Ukraine has significantly increased attacks on Crimea as its counteroffensive has been stalling. And we don't know this September 22nd strike that was last Friday. We don't know what the damage was. Ukraine claimed that 34 Russian officers were killed. They also claimed that the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet was killed, but he showed up at a Russian Defense Ministry meeting on Tuesday, and there was more footage of him released on Wednesday. And, Russia has not confirmed any deaths, so we just don't really know what happened in this strike. But still, there's just this big risk of escalation that's looming over all of us. The Russia saying that the U.S. and the U.K. are helping these attacks, which they definitely are to some extent. We just don't know the extent. They have pretext if they wanted to bomb a NATO base or something. Hopefully they choose not to do that. All right, so the next one here, China says major drills were launched to combat separatists. So this is about the drills around Taiwan. So this is from China's Taiwan Affairs Office. They said on Wednesday that the purpose of recent large-scale Chinese military drills around Taiwan is to combat the arrogance of Taiwan separatists, referring to recent actions by Taiwan to boost ties with the U.S. and other Western countries. So this is Taiwan Affairs spokeswoman Zhu Fenglian. She said, quote, "The purpose is to resolutely combat the arrogance of Taiwan independence separatist forces and their actions to seek independence," end quote. So she's referring there to the Taiwanese government, which is led by the President Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party. And the comments came after President Tsai hosted a delegation of 6 Australian members of parliament. Tsai was seeking Australian support for Taiwanese membership in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an 11-nation trade agreement. China is also seeking membership in this trade agreement, in this trade bloc. And Zhu said that Taiwan's participation in economic groupings should follow the One China principle, referring to Beijing's position that Taiwan is part of China. She said, quote, "The Democratic Progressive Party's attempt to seek independence in the name of economy and trade will not succeed," end quote. So she referred again to the military drills and said that they would continue as long as Taiwan continues what Beijing views as provocations. And they view these contacts with other governments as provocations. She said, quote, "As long as Taiwan independence's provocations continue, the People's Liberation Army's actions to safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity will not stop," end quote. So in recent weeks, Chinese military activity around Taiwan has spiked. On September 18th, Taiwan's defense ministry said that it detected a record number of Chinese warplanes in the area, although they did not come close to Taiwan's airspace. But still, it's noticeable that there's been a lot more Chinese military activity around Taiwan. And China has typically held large-scale drills around Taiwan in response to specific events, such as when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan last year. That sparked the largest ever Chinese live-fire exercises in the area. But this recent activity appears to be more spread out and more sustained. And analysts told the South China Morning Post, and these are analysts based in China, they say what they're calling cross-theater exercises could become routine. This could be a common thing now, or just kind of a sustained presence of planes and ships flying and sailing around. And the U.S. has been increasing its military and diplomatic support for Taiwan in the name of deterrence, but these policies have led to much more Chinese military activity in the region, and it seems like war is becoming more likely. All right, so the next one here, North Korea says that the U.S. has the world on the brink of nuclear war. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The North Korean ambassador to the UN warned that tensions with the U.S. have escalated so far that there is a realistic potential for a nuclear conflict. The head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, expressed concern that nuclear tension between several states risks a catastrophe of epic proportions. So Kim Song, who is Pyongyang's representative at the UN, delivered an address to the General Assembly on Tuesday. He said, quote, "Owing to the reckless and continued hysteria of nuclear showdown on the part of the U.S. and its following forces, the year 2023 has been recorded as an extremely dangerous year that the military security situation in and around the Korean Peninsula was driven closer to the brink of nuclear war. Due to Seoul's sycophantic and humiliating policy of depending on outside forces, the Korean Peninsula is in a hair-trigger situation with imminent danger of nuclear war, end quote. So he blamed Washington for attempting to create an Asian NATO that will bring a new Cold War structure to Northeast Asia. And, Biden has really increased U.S. military activity on the Korean Peninsula since he came into office, sending bombers over there, sending the nuclear-armed submarine over there, and that was the first time the U.S. did that since the 1980s, so sending nuclear weapons and saying, look, we got nukes. There's no reason to do that other than provocation. And then you have North Korea launching missiles, so the U.S. is saying that they're doing this in response to the missile tests, and then it provokes more missile launches from the north. And of course, this is also part of the buildup aimed at China. The U.S. is kind of getting two for the price of one here. Provocations against North Korea and China. They just recently did big military drills in the Yellow Sea, which the U.S. hasn't done in a while. And that, China's not happy about that. So I think a lot of people aren't paying attention to North Korea because, there's so much going on right now. But just the fact that you have North Korea saying that this year, the risk of nuclear war is really high, I think is something more people should be paying attention to. All right, the next one here, U.S. soldier who crossed into North Korea is in American custody. This article is from AP. I don't know if I even went over this when this American soldier crossed into North Korea from South Korea. Apparently, he was facing some disciplinary action in the U.S. military, and he just ran for it and crossed into North Korea. But now the U.S. has secured his release. He sprinted across the heavily fortified border into North Korea more than 2 months ago, and he's on his way back to the U.S. And these U.S. officials said that Sweden and China helped with the transfer. Apparently, Swedish officials took him to the border, the North Korea border with China, where the U.S. ambassador to China accepted him, and they put him in custody, and now he's on the way back to the U.S. So maybe this shows there's some room for diplomacy with the U.S. and North Korea, even though there's no other signs. This was mediated, obviously, by Sweden. But still, North Korea decided to let him go and didn't decide to keep him or use him as some kind of leverage. It seemed like this, they got him pretty quickly. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. supports anti-Assad protests in southern Syria. So a U.S. official spoke with a Druze spiritual leader to express support for protests against the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad that have been taking place in Syria's southern Suwaida governorate. That's a southern province in Syria, the southwestern tip of the country. The U.S. Embassy in Syria wrote on X that Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Ethan Goldrich, quote, spoke with Druze spiritual leader Sheikh Hekmat al-Hajari, reiterating our support for Syrians' freedom of expression, including peaceful protests in Suwaida, end quote. So these protests in Suwaida, which is a Druze majority area, according to the Cradle, they broke out on August 16th after the Syrian government raised civil servant salaries but cut fuel subsidies amid a collapse in the value of the Syrian pound. The demonstrations have continued since then with calls for the overthrow of Assad. 3 members of Congress also recently spoke with al-Hajari, this Druze spiritual leader, and they spoke with him to express bipartisan support for the protests. And that includes Representative Joe Wilson, a Republican from South Carolina, Brendan Boyle, Democrat from Pennsylvania, and French Hill, Republican from Arkansas. So Boyle told The National last week that he reaffirmed bipartisan congressional support for these protests. And this definitely has echoes of 2011 when the protests broke out in Syria, and that started the chaotic and brutal war, what was really a proxy war, the U.S. and the Gulf nations funding all these opposition groups in Syria, and many of them were either Al-Qaeda or linked to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And the support for these protests, this U.S. support for this protest movement comes as the U.S. is looking to exert more pressure on the Assad government as more countries are normalizing relations with Syria. Assad recently traveled to China for the first time since war broke out in Syria in 2011. And back in May, the Arab League voted to readmit Syria despite opposition from the U.S. So on Wednesday, Senators Marco Rubio and Jim Reich introduced the Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act, and that bill aims to expand sanctions on Syria in an effort to stop more countries from normalizing with Damascus. So while these U.S. officials claim to support the Syrian people, U.S. sanctions on Syria are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction and have had a devastating impact on the civilian population, creating the economic conditions that sparked the Suwaida protests. So the U.S. causes the crisis and then exploits it. So on top of these sanctions, the U.S. also backs the Kurdish-led SDF in Syria, which allows the U.S. to occupy about 1/3 of Syria's territory in the east, where most of the country's oil and wheat resources are located. It seems like the U.S. might have some ideas to keep Syria destabilized. All right, the next one here, Iran says Netanyahu threatened a nuclear attack. So Iran has lodged a formal complaint to the UN accusing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of threatening a nuclear attack on the Islamic Republic. In his speech at the UN General Assembly last week, Netanyahu said, quote, "Above all, Iran must face a credible nuclear threat. As long as I'm Prime Minister of Israel, I will do everything in my power to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons," end quote. So he said that they must face a credible nuclear threat, which is a very provocative thing to say. His office later said that Netanyahu misspoke, insisting that the prepared speech said credible military threat instead of credible nuclear threat. And that is something Netanyahu does say a lot, credible military threat. It's still a threat. He's still up there at the UN General Assembly threatening Iran. So Iran issued a complaint noting that Israel has an arsenal of nuclear weapons that it does not acknowledge. And that's always an important point to make when we're talking about this issue. You have the Israelis constantly warning about Iran trying to build a nuclear weapon, even though there's no indication that they are. And that's something that's been recently reaffirmed by U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon. But the Israelis will still make that claim. All the while, they have a secret nuclear arsenal that they do not declare, that is not subject to any kind of inspections. We don't even know how many warheads they have because they keep it secret. Iran's ambassador to the UN, Amir Saeed Iravani, accused Netanyahu of making, quote, explicit threats to use nuclear weapons against an independent member state of the United Nations, end quote. He said that the threat is more serious coming from Israel, which he described as a, quote, illegitimate regime that has been widely condemned for aggression, for apartheid policies, and for support for terrorism, as well as for possessing an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction alongside advanced conventional weapons, end quote. So Iran is, just not happy with the threats from Israel. And I just thought this was an interesting story that, that slip, if it was a slip from Netanyahu, or maybe he did actually want to kind of make that threat. All right, so the last one here, Senator Menendez pleads not guilty to bribery charges. So this is just an article from Axios that I put in about Menendez, and he pleaded not guilty Wednesday to federal charges in an alleged bribery scheme in a New York City court. Menendez, who has resisted mounting calls to resign from within his own party, has now been indicted twice in a corruption case in the last decade. He and his wife, Nadine Menendez, who was also arraigned and pleaded not guilty in federal court, were charged with conspiracy to commit bribery, conspiracy to commit honest services fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion under color of official right. And the story here is basically that he was accepting bribes and it was to benefit the government of Egypt in his position. his very powerful position as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from John Kuriakou. I was the only U.S. official imprisoned over torture program because I opposed it. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. Washington's strategic overextension. One from James W. Carden. It is time to embrace a less than grand strategy. One from Jonathan Hoffman. Biden's Middle East deal is a disaster. And one from Dave Lindorf. NPR report on depleted uranium for Ukraine was a one-source dud. So please go check all that out. Go check out our blog. We have a lot of stuff over there. If you're in Santa Cruz, California, on September 30th, that's Saturday, there is a rally there, a peace rally that's co-sponsored by Code Pink and Diffuse Nuclear War. So there's information there if you want to check that out. Noon at the Town Clock in Santa Cruz, so midday. So go check that out. But that is everything from me. You could always help the show out just by sharing it online, liking, subscribing on YouTube, or if you watch on Odyssey, Rumble. If you listen to the audio version like most of you do, you could leave reviews on some of the podcast apps, or again, just sharing the show, telling people about antiwar.com, trying to grow this thing. I really appreciate all that stuff. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.